Back to the president's interview with Vox. He was asked directly if he believes the media overstates the level of alarm that people should have about terrorism, and he answered absolutely. Now, this interview, I guess, was done a couple of weeks ago, clearly before the latest news about Kayla Mueller. Does the president still believe that the threat of terrorism is overstated?
John, I think what's true is that the threat from terror that is faced by the American people in the United States is much different than it has been before. That the kind of terror act that we saw that was carried out on September 1st, 2001, was carried out by an organization that had operated for quite some time with impunity in the region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, that they had had the time and the space to plan and carry out this terribly tragic conspiracy to wreak havoc in the lives of thousands, if not millions, of Americans. Because of actions that have been taken by the previous administration and by this administration, terrorist organizations no longer have that same capacity. And that means that the risk that is facing the American people is different. Now, the president and his team continue to be vigilant because there are dangerous organizations that continue to exist and to operate. We were talking just earlier about Yemen, that the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is an organization that operates in Yemen and is a dangerous organization. This is probably the most dangerous of the Al-Qaeda affiliates. And we take very seriously the threat that they pose, and there are any number of steps that this administration takes on a daily basis to protect the American people. But what people should be mindful of is that the terror risk that faces the American people is much different than it used to be.
But so he said, and let me just read the second part of the question. He was asked if the media overstates the level of alarm people should have about terrorism as opposed to longer-term problems of climate change and epidemic disease. He says absolutely. So let me just clarify. Is the president saying, as he seems to be implying here, that the threat of climate change is greater than the threat of terrorism?
I think, John, the point that the president is making is that there are many more people on an annual basis who have to confront the impact, the direct impact on their lives of climate change or on the spread of a disease than on terrorism.
So the answer is yes, the president thinks that climate change is a greater threat than terrorism.
I think the point that the president is making is that when you're talking about the direct daily impact of these kinds of challenges on the daily lives of Americans, particularly Americans living in this country, that direct impact is more that more people are directly affected by those things than by terrorism.
So climate change is more of a clear and present danger to the United States than terrorism.
Well, I think even the Department of Defense has spoken to the significant threat that climate change poses to our national security interests, principally because of the impact that it can have on countries with less well-developed infrastructure than we have.
I'm not asking if it's a significant threat. I'm asking if it's a greater threat. Okay.
Well, again, I wouldn't have a whole lot more to say about what the president has said in that interview.
Well, back to the question Jim was asking about his description of the shooting at the Kosher Deli in Paris as being randomly shoot a bunch of folks in a deli of Paris. I mean, this was not a random shooting of a bunch of folks in a deli in Paris. This was an attack on a Kosher Deli. Does the president have any doubt that those terrorists attacked that deli because there would be Jews in that deli?
Well, John, it is clear from the terrorists and some of the writings that they put out afterwards what their motivation was. The adverb that the president chose was used to indicate that the individuals who were killed in that terrible, tragic incident were killed not because of who they were, but because of where they randomly happened to be.
They weren't killed because they were in a Jewish deli, though? They were in a kosher deli?
These individuals were not targeted by name. This is the point.
Not by name, but by religion, were they not?
Well, John, there were people other than just Jews who were in that deli.
Do you see any doubt that deli was attacked because it was a kosher deli? This was
no,
not
John.
Any random deli.
No, John.
It was a kosher deli.
I answered the question once. No. Ed.
So then why didn't the president acknowledge that? If he knows that and it's obvious, why didn't he say that?
The president has acknowledged that on many occasions when he's had the opportunity to speak about this incident.
But he didn't there. And in terms of the media hype, do you think a Jordanian pilot being burned alive is just the media hyping something?
Ed, we've talked on a number of occasions, and certainly I've had the opportunity, as recently as at the end of last week, to talk about how the United States of America stands shoulder to shoulder with our partners in Jordan as they confront the terrible tragedy of seeing one of their military pilots who is serving and defending their country be killed in such a brutal, inhumane way. I do think it exposes the bankrupt ideology of ISIL, and I think it is a pretty clear illustration of how the international community has been galvanized to take on this threat, a threat that the President has led the creation of this international coalition to confront, degrade, and ultimately destroy.
But if it's a big threat that this international coalition is confronting, why did the President compare himself to a big city mayor fighting crime?
Well, Ed, I think what the President is talking about is he's talking about the necessity of assuming some leadership. And the President has stepped forward. Again, we've got 60 members of this broader coalition. And those countries are members of this coalition because of the leadership of this President. And the President has succeeded in leveraging the influence of the United States of America to build this coalition and even to get countries in the region to fly alongside American military pilots as they're carrying out airstrikes against ISIL targets.
Right, but he wasn't talking about the coalition back on the mayor. He said, I'm sort of like a big city mayor. Is that the President trying to downplay the threat?
Mm-hmm. And the President devotes significant periods of his day on a regular basis to confronting the threat that is posed by ISIL, by al-Qaeda affiliates, and by other organizations around the globe that seek to do harm to the American people. The point that the President made, and I will restate, is that the President certainly has a responsibility to take these threats seriously. And there are significant resources that are dedicated to protecting the American people. But when it comes to the American people's level of concern and the amount of risk that they face, it is clearly different than the kind of risk that the American people faced in the days before.